But today, what I'm going to talk about is close encounters with the C-119 Boxcar. But just a little bit of background. When I graduated from pilot training in 1949, my first assignment was the C-82s in Germany. The C-82 was built in 1944. One of the big missions was the land invasion of Japan, which we never used, of course. It was an underpowered airplane, had a lot of problems, but I was assigned to it, and I flew it for 3 years in Germany. When my tour was up, I was hoping to be assigned to a more modern aircraft. My next assignment was at Donaldson Air Force Base, flying C-82s. By that time, I was an experienced C-82 driver. I was an instructor pilot for a reserve outfit that had been flying C-47. We were hoping to get the C-119. Now, the C-119 resembles the C-82, but it's an entirely different aircraft. Different engines, had reverse thrust props, had Hamilton standard hollow point propeller. It had anti-skid brakes. The cockpit was streamlined. It had a more powerful engine and cruised at 200 knots. It's an airplane that we're all looking forward to getting versus the old C-82. But I'm going to see the C-82. And I think it was on a Monday in April of 1953. Our ops officer, Ted Bishop, called the 4 flight commanders, of which I was one, into his office and said, "We're finally getting our C-119. We said, "Really, when?" He said, "Tomorrow." We said, "How is that possible? None of us are checked out in the C-119. He said, "I thought of that. We have an instructor pilot coming over this afternoon in an airplane to check out the 4 flight commanders in the C-119. After lunch, the C-119 pulled up to our area. The young instructor pilot came out and said, "I can devote 4 hours to you guys." 2-hour walk around, which took care of our ground school. Then we assembled in the cockpit. He said, "I can give you 30 minutes each. 3 takeoffs and 3 landings, and you'll all be checked out in the C-119. Sounds familiar, Chuck? The next day, on the C-82, they flew us down to Miami Beach, where the outfit in Miami Beach was being disbanded, and they had almost brand new C-119Cs. I was the mission commander. I was 24 years old. We went to Miami, filled out the paperwork. I signed for 4 airplanes, had a briefing. We decided to fly back to Donaldson in formation, about a 3-hour flight. After takeoff, we leveled off at 8,500 feet. The sun was just setting. The cockpit was getting dark. I looked at the overhead panel. I turned on the anti-collision light, the wing and tail light. I want to turn on the instrument lights. Where the hell is the switch for the instrument lights? It was getting dark. I was getting so embarrassed. The crew chief came up with a flashlight. He says, "Here, you use this flashlight so you can see the instrument light." About this time, one of my wingmen called. He said, "Red Leader, how do you turn on the instrument lights?" I was so damn embarrassed. I was the mission commander. I unstrapped my safety belt. I knew there had to be switches in that airplane for instrument lights, but I didn't know where they were. But I leaned way forward, and up in front of the throttle quadrant, there's a series of switches. You can't see them when you're sitting upright in the seat, but you know they're there. After you know they're there, you don't have to see them. This guy called me again. He says, "How do you turn on the instrument lights?" I said, "Well, you stupid ass. Look in front of the instrument panel, the throttle quadrant, there's a set of switches." And he called back and he said, "Well, thanks a lot, Lou." I said, "Well, that's why I'm mission commander, to answer all the questions." The next day, I was instructing new pilots in the C-119. It was a hell of an improvement over the C-82. The following month, I was sent to Sacramento to ferry an airplane coming out of the depot with McClellan to ferry it to Ashia, Japan, which was to be used in the Korean War. The Korean War was still going. This was May of 1953. I was still 24 years old. It's a little cold. I caught it from Vince. Anyway, that's true. Anyway, from San Francisco to Hawaii is around 2,200 miles. It's extended range to the C-119. We had a 1,000-gallon rubber tank in the fuselage, add extra fuel. We had to wait for a maximum of 70 knot minus wind factor going west. Spent about a week in the colony. Took off for Hawaii, leveled off at 10,000 feet on autopilot above the clouds. Beautiful day, and I said, for this they're paying me a salary. I had a navigator, Bobby used to still away. Had a navigator, I still remember his name, Baxter Boyd. It was a 12-hour flight. He was up in the Astrodome, and he said, Lou, he said, we just passed the point of no return. Got about 5 hours to go. We just made a position report with Ocean Station North. And I said, well, why don't you do what a navigator is good at doing? He said, what's that? I said, hand me a cup of coffee. So in reciprocating the joke, Baxter brought up a cup of coffee that was filled right to the brim. He said, well, the steel nerves of a pilot, you ought to be able to drink this coffee without spilling it. I was taking this coffee cup closely without spilling it, and boom, 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 boom. The right engine started vibrating. Dick wanted to talk about that one. The right engine started vibrating, spilled coffee and hot coffee in my leg. I switched hands. My turn, Dick. I threw the mixture, right mixture into full rich. The engine smoothed out. I wiped off my leg, handed the cup of coffee back to the navigator, and I said, don't drink it, I'll get to it later. The engine was running smoothly now, but now we're burning more fuel. So with one engine and I took the mixture and played with it in intermediate position, the engine would run smooth, but we're burning more fuel. So I got up from my table, worked with the navigator, Baxter Boyd. He spoke English. He was born in the United States. And we figured, well, we had enough fuel to make the trip. I sat back down and the left engine started backfiring. Same thing, mixture rich, on an intermediate position, so the engine runs smooth. But now we're burning a lot more fuel. Taking a new calculation, I didn't think we'd have enough fuel to reach Hawaii. Through the station north, we got a phone patch to the Coast Guard at Barber Point. Declared an emergency, said we may have to ditch before we reach Hawaii. They were very accommodating. They gave us the sea conditions close to Hawaii. They said they put a PPM on alert in case we needed it. You know, I hate to admit this, but as a 24-year-old, I was actually looking forward to ditching that 119 because we hadn't ditched the 119, but I don't want to share that idiosyncrasy. I said, well, we have a couple of choices. We can fly until we're about to run out of fuel and they can ditch it with power, or we can all bail out and the PPM will pick us up. We decided on the latter course of action. Baxter came out of the Astrodome and he said, the wind factor has decreased. I think we'll make Hawaii. And we did. As we rounded Barber Points, all 4 fuel gauges were pumped and emptied. We had raised the rubber fuel tank in the fuselage to get a few more gallons out of it. The engines were still running. I brought the power back, made a wide circle, almost power off approach, touchdown, and a Martin smooth landing. I advanced the throttles. The engines are still running. Taxied in. A nice friendly major met us. I told him about the situation. He said, this airplane just came out of the depot. I said, yep. He says, let me check it over. So they start uncovering the engine, and he called me to stand. He said, look at here. He had a rubber leather glove, and he was able to remove several spark plugs from the last row of cylinders. They were finger tight coming out of the depot. He said, you young guys take about 3 days off, and we'll fix this airplane for the rest of it into Japan and ran like a Singer slow machine. Those spark plugs, the same thing in the other engine. The last row of cylinders, the spark plugs are put in finger tight.
Hey, did they blame the navigator for that, for these spark plugs?
Well, he was asleep, so we couldn't disturb. We didn't want to disturb him.
Okay.
But Bob, I make sure Bob's still awake. I brought this. Every time I see you dozing off, Bob, I'm going to give you a duck call.
You can't top him swimming.
Yeah, don't even try.
I got back to Greenville, and as you guys know, especially if you've flown big airplanes, things go to hell damn fast. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was getting ready to go to beer call. Friday beer call was a big thing in those days, and I guess still today. The maintenance officer said, you need a test stop just around the pattern for an airplane. They've changed the elevator. All you have to do is just make it around the pattern. 10-minute flight. So just a 10-minute flight. I made one of the many mistakes I made in life. We didn't take a parachute with us. We didn't take an oxygen mask. Just going to be a 10-minute flight in the C-119. After takeoff, smoke started filling the cockpit. And air smell. We looked and the smoke was blowing out of the cabin, out of the car compartment into the cockpit. My God, this is supposed to be a 10-minute flight. I said, gear up. The gear wouldn't retract. I said, flaps up. The flaps wouldn't retract. The cowl flaps were in trail. I said, open the cowl flaps. The engine's overheating. The cowl flaps wouldn't open. I was breathing oxygen out of the tube, not a mask. Declared an emergency, made a downwind. On base, the cylinder temperatures right to the top of the gauge. The engines started detonating. They were rocking. I thought they might fall off. And we made a marked and smooth landing. Crash crew people came up. We opened the rear cargo doors and dissipated the smoke. And there was a main big junction box that was burnt. We opened that junction box, and the remnants of the burnt flashlight fell out. Some mechanic had left a flashlight in the junction box. This is supposed to be a 10-minute flight, and damn near ended our life right there. In the fall of '53, I was transferred to Newbury, Germany, C-119C. By this time, I was 25 years old, a lot of experience. They accepted me right away from the 40th Squadron. Our mission was really a nice mission to support the NATO forces with our aircraft. One mission we had was to fly a C-119 to Bordeaux, France. Take off at 9 o'clock at night, arrive at Bordeaux about midnight, 2 hours on the ground, take off from Bordeaux about 2 a.m., fly over to Paris. Destination was Burtonwood, Manchester, England, cargo flight. I had a real nice co-pilot. I let him fly the left seat from Bordeaux to Burtonwood. We were over Paris in heavy rain, smooth but heavy rain. We couldn't, the radio beacon was spinning because we were in heavy precipitation. But I knew we were over Paris because the clouds were a bright white reflection of Paris. I told my co-pilot in heavy rain, I said, here's something kind of neat. I turn on the landing lights, and all these rain pellets come in like a million diamonds flying past the cockpit. He said, that's pretty neat. I said, yeah, that is kind of a nice light show. About that time, boom! The right prop ran away. You guys that had flown receps and had right props run away. The prop was jigging around 3,000 RPM. But the problem is the prop may spin off the shaft and fly into the aircraft. That is a problem. And you notice, right prop is right close to the cockpit. I reached up, pulled the throttle back to idle, the mixture to cut off. I punched the feather button. I held down the feather button. The prop is not feathery. Now we got a flat prop out there with no fuel, a hell of a big drag. The co-pilot says, what do you want me to do? I said, make a 180-degree turn, fill in the left rudder trim to offset the drag. We're going to make an emergency landing back at Orly Field, which is a joint French-American air base. I called the French controller. This was about 3 o'clock in the morning. So they had the second team in. He spoke very little English. I said, Mayday, Mayday. He said, Parlez-vous français? I said, no, I don't understand Mayday. He said, Parlez-vous français? He said, what's your problem? I said, we can't maintain altitude. We have an uncontrolled propeller, runaway propeller. He said, what is runaway propeller? So the co-pilot, I told him, hold your altitude as long as you can. When the airspeed decreased to 140 knots, just accept the descent at 140 knots. He had full left rudder in, holding the drag. We couldn't hold 9,000 feet. We were descending, went to 8, to 7. I told the Paris controller we needed lower altitude. He says, no, lower altitude is not authorized. I said, forget it. When radar vectors, he says, radar off the air. I contacted Orly Field, an English-speaking controller, but our beacon was just going around in circles because of the precipitation. I said, we have a problem. We need to land. He says, you're clear, don't try me. You're clear to land when you reach Orly. I said, do you have radar? He says, no radar. By now we passed through 5,000 feet. The co-pilot had full left rudder to hold off the drag. And we're still descending about 300 feet a minute. We got down to about 2,500 feet. It's funny, the thoughts that went through my mind is that I thought, how high is the Eiffel Tower? I thought, geez, if I fly in the Eiffel Tower, I'll certainly get my name in the news. And so then the crew chief, got 3 of us on board, just the co-pilot, myself, and the crew chief. The crew chief said, should I start dumping up cargo, loose cargo? I said, you can't do that, we're over Paris. He said, how about bailing out? I said, we can't bail out for the same reason that the airplane fly into Paris. But this time now we're down around 2,500 feet at the base of the clouds, still in the rain, but I can see lights on the ground. And I looked off to the right. Here's a lighter runway, about a mile away. I called Orly and I said, we've got your airport in sight. I'm going to roll wide right base. He says, you're clear to land. I said, gear down, flaps down. I made a right turn, and the differential drag disappeared. I looked out and the right prop was feathered. I thought, my God, the Grim Reaper must have gone back to bed. Made a nice, smooth Martin landing. Tried to call Orly on the radio, no answer. Got the blue taxi lights. I couldn't figure out why Orly wasn't answering us because we were on the ground in Orly, I thought. As I turned off the taxiway close to the terminal, Le Bourget Airport. 27 years after Lindbergh landed there, I landed there about 3 o'clock in the morning, no reception. We got a taxi to the hotel, spent 3 days there before we could move the airplane out. Somebody came in and took our cargo. That was another close encounter in C-119. In August of 1954, I was in a flight from Manchester, England, Birkenwood, back to Munich. And you guys that have flown over England, I was at 9,000 feet. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was clear as a bell. We were flying over London, and we enjoyed the sight because we're trying to pick out historic sites from 9,000 feet. It's a rarity to see London so clear. And we were all enjoying being tourists at 9,000 feet and getting paid for it. And all of a sudden the airplane, zoom, 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 just started shuddering and shaking up and down like mad. It was shaking so bad that I could hardly hold my hand on the control column. I reached up and put my hand in the throttles, and my hand, worse than my left hand, was shaking. And I pulled back in the power, pulled back in the control column, We were cruising about 200 knots. As the airspeed decreased, the shaking seemed to decrease the same amount. I finally got down to 120 knots, and the airplane smoothed out. We're still in the air. Declared an emergency in London. They said, what are your intentions? I said, we're going to divert to Manston, England. It's a fighter base on the east coast of England, down near the tip of England. But I said, before we do that, we're doing a little bit of experiment. Bob's still awake?
I'm awake.
I said, before we do that, we're going to do a little bit of an experimentation. I want to make sure when I put the gear and the flaps down that the aircraft is still controllable. Descended to, kept it at 120 knots, descended to 5,000 feet, had the crew chief bring up parachutes, and we all put on parachutes. In case the aircraft was not controllable, we would sail out over open country. Lowered the gear, lowered the flaps, the airplane was still flying. Kept it at 120 knots, made a GC ground control approach into Manston. Got a smooth mark landing, taxied off, shut down the engine. We wanted to walk around the airplane and see if we could find the cause of the problem. The cause was very easy to determine. We got back to the elevator, and there's a push rod that's connected to the trim tab, and the bolt was missing. So that trim tab was allowed to flutter, shaking the whole airplane. We put a new bolt, connected the push rod to the elevator trim, checked for cracks, flew the airplane back to Munich with no problems. I gotta wipe my nose because you guys are making me cry. I wrote a long report on this. So it said they should be checking these bolts, check them, x-ray the bolts, see if they're the right strength. And I made a report that if any other pilot experiences the same problem, what to do. Ironically, about a month later, there was a C-119 crew from Rhine, Maine that experienced severe vibrations and oscillations over flight over Paris, flight over southern France. 5 crew members, they all bailed out. The wreckage, they found the bolt missing from that push rod. He'd never read my message, and it wasn't disseminated to him. In November, how are we doing in time? I'm still okay. In November of 1954, we were told that we were going to receive C-119Gs. The C-119C had a lot of problems. Actually lost prop plays, vibrations so severe, the engine so severe that engines would actually fall off the aircraft. I'll save your place, Glenn.
Right back.
All right. You want me to keep on, or should I hold? He said I can continue. Anyway, we were sent back. I was sent back to Hagerstown, Maryland, to pick up a C-119G. The C-119G had a lot of nice modifications. One thing, it had a right turbo compound engine, 3350. But it was now developed to 3,500 shaft horsepower. If you're shaking your head, you know the engine. It had 3 power recovery turbines that were power recovery turbines off the exhaust. That gave it a 600 extra horsepower, water injection, but it was a compound engine. They couldn't get the 4360 anymore because it was being used on the K50, KB50, C-124, B-36, KC-97, so they went to the right turbo compound engine. Plus a nice feature that we liked from the crew standpoint, previous, if you had to bail out of this airplane, you had to make a 40-foot run all the way to the back. You couldn't bail out front because it's right in front of the prop. And in many cases, if you wanted to bail out, you had to climb over cargo. So that was a hell of an object. Go from the cockpit, run 40 feet and bail out the back. The C-119G had a pilot escape chute right behind the aircraft commander. You would open it, pull up this compartment, the door, and the door in the bottom with jettison and you nice straight chute, you can bail out. So that was a nice feature that we look forward to. I picked up this brand new airplane at Hagerstown. Had 1 hour on it just to test out. It was like picking up a new car. They had paper in the car, paper on the floor in the cockpit. It smelled like a new airplane. Flew from Argentine, Newfoundland, the Azores, and then it was going to be an 11-hour flight back to Munich. The airplane was just beautiful. Anything new was beautiful, except the new wife. Sometimes they're a problem. That's true. Anyway, I want to tell you something that I want you to remember. On an 11-hour flight from the Azores back to Munich, after we got about 1 hour west of Frankfurt, the right prop started going, room, 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 room. We would cruise at 2,400 RPM. The right prop, 25, 26, 27. I took the right prop control, trying to control the RPM. I had the prop control moved, now remember this, I had the prop control moved the full 4 inches right back against the stop. The RPM was still increasing. I controlled a little bit with the throttle. I discussed it with the crew. We could try to feather it, but if we did, we'd have to land at Rhine Main. We all wanted to get home, so we decided to continue on. So and this is important, which I'm going to point out in a little bit. For the next 3.5 hours, we flew that airplane with a right prop that was up that we couldn't control, with the prop control lever all the way back against the stop. We landed and made a right up. After the flights out of Munich were very, very enjoyable because we were supporting all the NATO countries. Within a month, we heard that they had 2 C-119 fatal crashes in the United States with the prop going into reverse in flight. We received an emergency red border order from the pilot's manual. Basically, it said the Aeroproducts prop has no protection from going into reverse in flight. And if you cannot control the RPM, remember I mentioned I had this back about 4 inches all the way to the stop. This emergency order said if you cannot control the prop by moving the prop control 1 shaft width, which is about 1 inch, get this job. It said the emergency procedure is bail out because the prop may go into reverse. Can you imagine that? I was on a flight from Munich to Athens over the Ionian Sea. I had a full colonel on the right seat who displaced the co-pilot. He was giving me flight time. He was on the sunny side. He had the seat tilted all the way back, sound asleep. I figured he was doing wing headquarters. Solid wing headquarters problem because he was sound asleep. He wasn't a navigator. He was a pilot. And the right and the left prop started rising in RPM. I tried to control it with the prop control. I had it right back against the stop, and the RPM was still rising. Emergency order said we should bail out. We were over water. The crew chief and the displaced co-pilot knew the seriousness of it, and they started went to the cargo compartment, brought up life vests, one-man dinghies, and parachutes. The colonel was sound asleep. I reached over and shook the colonel. I said, "Wake up, Colonel, you can solve problems later." And he sat up and he said, "Lieutenant," he says, "do you know that the props are out of sync?" And I said, "No shit." I said, "Look at the prop control levers, they're like this." And I handed him the red bordered emergency procedure. He could read. Well, he's a full colonel, he had to be able to read. And he read this order, and he got down to the point where it says we're supposed to bail out. He said, "Jesus, are we going to bail out?" He looked over at my crew chief and co-pilot are putting on chutes and one-man dinghies and life vests. And he said, "Are we going to bail out?" And I said, "Not now, we're over water." I said, "The airplane's still running." I said, "What we're going to do I said, there's an island up there, you see it about 10 miles away. When we get over that island, I'm going to try to put this prop in the feather position. If it goes into reverse, I'm going to put the other engine in reverse, the other prop in reverse to offset the differential thrust. And I said, if we do that, we're all going to bail out. But move faster and help us. I'm the last one out. And the crew chief had his hand on the Cape hatch, ready to open it if I just said bail out. We got over that little island, and I said, ready? I took the prop control, threw it in the feather. It seemed like a long time, it only took a few seconds, that prop feather. We made an emergency landing at Roxas, F-84 Greek fighter base. We spent about a week there while they worked on the airplane. Had a hell of a good time. One more close encounters in the C-119. I mentioned it had power recovery turbines. These turbines, coming from the exhaust, probably spun around 30,000 RPM. They're about, 2 feet in diameter. They developed extra, 600 extra horsepower. But there have been occasions when they throw a bucket and the turbine would explode like a bomb. It was so severe, they were concerned about it, that they had armor plating on the side of the fuselage in case an inboard PRT would blow so it wouldn't kill passengers. Very considerate of the Air Force. I was in a flight from Athens back to Gideon. We just leveled off at 18,000 feet to clear the Alps. And all of a sudden, boom! There was a hell of a big explosion on the right side. The torque, the RPM, the fuel flow, and everything started flickering. And I reached up, feathered the prop, and it did feather. But now we're at 18,000 feet in one engine. And the co-pilot, I had a young co-pilot and a young crew chief. We're the only 3 on board. And they were very nervous. You guys that have experienced emergencies with sea ship, one thing you have to do is get control of the crew. I could tell they were very excited, but I needed their help. I reached in my flight suit, I pulled out a brand new package of juicy fruit gum. And I said, why don't you guys have a stick of gum? And I said, you notice the new stick, when you open it up, you can smell it, it tastes much better. That little effort kind of relaxed them a little bit. I said, we're going to divert to Aviano. Gary knows what I'm talking about. It was the Aviano. And we made an emergency landing in Aviano. Spent about a week there. A lot of pizza, red wine. Before they fixed our airplane, when I called our maintenance base, they said, what the hell did you do? Because we had a power recovery turbine that exploded on the outward right side, and it was like being hit by a big flak burst. Holes all over the wing, cowling was blown off. The airplane was really not flyable before we get it fixed. One more emergency I want to tell you about. Bob's still there. You ready, Bob?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I hope this is the last one.
Oh, who knows? Maybe a question or two.
Where'd Bob go?
He's wide awake. I was going down Rome Valley, about 9,000 feet. For some reason, I had another colonel on board. They liked to fly with me, I guess. But he liked to. Well, I was a good pilot. I stayed alive. But we were in the heavy, clear icing at 9,000 feet. Now, clear ice is very, very dangerous, much more so than rime ice. One of the problems with the heated wing, which is anti-icing, if you're in severe icing, the ice may melt but build up behind the wing. And I knew this was happening because we were at 9,000 feet, couldn't hold altitude, I was advancing, I had power to max power. With a nose-eye attitude, I knew ice was building up at the nose, which we can't control. The probe for the free air temperature was like a megaphone of ice. Ice sitting on windshield wipers building. But you declared an emergency. I asked Leon for the freezing level, which is about 3,000 feet. We did a descending turn. We got down to about 3,000 feet. Sheets of ice flew off. Then we stayed low, went into Marseille. That exercise was over. These are just a few of the close encounters that I relate in my book, Close Encounters of the Pilot's Grim Reaper. This book is still available, and I go into much more detail now, as I do in most of my talks, and maybe my last one because I don't have any more space on the bullshit over there. I want to ask Chuck a question. They ended up using the C-119G for gunships. They converted about 6 of them to gunships. They put 20 millimeters and 50 calibers on the left side. The pilot with the laser would put it in the bank and just spray it at the jumper. Their theme song, remember what their theme song was, Chuck? Come on. Anyway, their theme song was Puff the Magic Dragon. Steve remembers that. Why did they use the theme song as Puff the Magic Dragon? Anybody know?
It's a sound of the weapons.
Well, partly. I watched an AC-47 gunship at night in a bank during the Tet Offensive. And when they opened up with all those weapons, it was a steady stream of fire, tracer fire. And what they related it to, the analogy they used, is like the fire from a dragon. Gary knows. So the C-119 also adopted that song, Puff the Magic Dragon, for the gunships. Anytime you visit a gunship crew, all of them knew that song by memory. I'm going to play it for you. Out of my war, Vietnamese war. Peter, Paul, Mary.
Thank you.
Up the magic dragon, lived by the sea, and thrived in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Little
Vietnamese war.
loved like a rascal pop, and rocked in strings and singing wax and other fancy stuff. Oh, Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Together they would travel on a boat to its billowed sails. Jackie kept a lookout perched on Puff's gigantic tail. Noble kings and princes would bow whenever they came. Pirate ships would lower their flags when Puff roared out his name. Oh, Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. A dragon lives forever, but not so little boys. Painted wings and giant's rings make way for other toys.
Can you lift the needle?
One way it happens.
Time for 2 questions, that's it.
Yeah.
Tell us your juxtaposition with this aircraft.
I don't have any.
Chuck doesn't have any connections with the aircraft or with me. We're just friends.
Okay.
But he's an Air Force veteran, and I thought that Chuck might be familiar with his song.
I should have known that, but my memory's about that long.
Well, if that's the only thing, that's good. Any other questions?
When you talked about the fact that the later Gs were the 3350s, were the earlier ones the 2800s?
No, the earlier ones, I failed to mention that, was the Pratt & Whitney 4360. I think I did mention that in the flight into Hawaii. It had 4 banks of 7 cylinders, 28 cylinders, 56 spark plugs. One of our problems on the 4360 and the B36 and the 124s and the 97s, they had an engine analyzer. So if you had a mag drop, they could pinpoint exactly which spark plug even was fouling. On the 119, we had no engine analyzer. So if we had a mag drop, the crew chiefs had to change all 56 spark plugs. Quite a job. Anything? Thanks, Vince.
No more questions. Let's hear it, Lou.